Welcome to the Greatest Philosophers in History series, where we delve into some of the most influential ideas and views on life championed by remarkable thinkers throughout human history. In this episode, our focus is on the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was a prolific 19th century writer and thinker whose work emerged during the Danish Golden Age, a period marked by intense intellectual and artistic activity. Although he claimed he was not a philosopher, since he mainly wrote about life, about how each individual might choose to live, and what it means to exist, Kierkegaard is generally recognized as the father of existentialism. This viewpoint emphasizes the reality of personal existence, subjective experience, and the quest to answer the timeless question, what is existence? Kierkegaard believed that this question is not purely theoretical, but must be answered subjectively by each person's lived actions. Indeed, he argued that we should all fashion a personal, experiential response to life, rather than rely on abstract systems or dogmatic traditions. Before Kierkegaard's time, the classical philosophies of Plato and Aristotle had enjoyed nearly 2,000 years of dominance in the Western canon. While these and other systematic philosophies certainly made remarkable contributions, Kierkegaard felt they overlooked or trivialized the importance of the individual's subjective experience. His writings, therefore, laid significant groundwork for what would later be called existentialism, a movement that gained its greatest fame roughly a century after his death through the work of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, who grappled with similar questions of human freedom, anxiety, and the absurd. A pivotal theme in Kierkegaard's thought is that while humanity has made astounding strides in the sciences, developing advanced technologies and understanding countless natural phenomena, little to no progress has occurred in the domain of personal, individual life. The fundamental struggles, joys, uncertainties, and anxieties of the human condition remain essentially unchanged. Our ancestors from centuries or millennia ago lived with many of the same interior experiences of fear, hope, doubt, and wonder that we do today. Kierkegaard insisted that each of us interprets the world according to the values we hold dear. These values not only shape our self-understanding, but also determine what we regard as reality. In other words, our personal perspective is, for him, the gateway to truth, albeit a truth that is inevitably subjective and intimately tied to our individual existence. Kierkegaard was born the youngest in a family of 7 children, most of whom tragically died young. Only Kierkegaard and his elder brother Peter, who would become a bishop, reached adulthood. Kierkegaard's father, Michael Peterson Kierkegaard, was already 57 when Søren was born, and the circumstances of the father's second marriage to a housemaid, just a year after his first wife's death, created gossip and an aura of scandal in the family. Despite these controversies, the elder Kierkegaard accumulated significant wealth as a merchant in Copenhagen. More importantly, he exerted an intense spiritual and intellectual influence on his son, shaping Søren's reflective, melancholic, and religiously inclined mind. Michael Kierkegaard was devout yet deeply troubled by a sense of sin, which dated back to an event he repeatedly recounted. As an 11-year-old boy tasked with tending sheep, cold and hungry, he stood on a hill and cursed God. That act of blasphemy weighed on him for the remainder of his long life. He died at 82, and he instilled in Søren a combination of intense religiosity, a sense of existential guilt, and a predisposition toward introspection. This background helps us understand why Kierkegaard, throughout his own works, wrestled so passionately with issues of faith, sin, and personal responsibility. In his youth, Kierkegaard was physically frail and socially awkward, but displayed a remarkable wit, lively imagination, and a penetrating intellect. He studied theology at the University of Copenhagen. However, his spiritual convictions and critical views led him to develop a deep dissatisfaction with the institutional Church of Denmark. At 27, he found himself torn between 2 major life choices: whether to marry Regine Olsen, the young woman he dearly loved, or to fulfill his father's dying wish for him to become a pastor. Alternatively, He could choose a less conventional route and devote himself entirely to writing, focusing on the unique, sometimes paradoxical qualities of his personality and intellect. Ultimately, he broke off his engagement to Regine, causing a minor social scandal and much emotional pain, and decided upon a life of writing, supported by the sizable inheritance his father had left him. With his personal life in turmoil, Kierkegaard turned inward, making himself the subject of his reflections. He channeled his experiences and beliefs into a literary career that combined irony, satire, religious reflection, and philosophical inquiry. Despite the seriousness of his ideas, he often used playful disguises, employing pseudonyms, fictional prefaces, and invented narrators in his books. His reason for these stylistic choices was partly to avoid didactic preaching. He wanted readers to engage with arguments and perspectives, gradually arriving at their own conclusions. He also used these techniques as a way of revealing the complexity of the human condition, rather than propose a simple system. He provided multiple voices and vantage points, challenging the reader to wrestle with paradox and ambiguity. Kierkegaard's personal eccentricities, along with attacks from the satirical magazine Corsair, caused him to remain something of an outcast in Copenhagen society. Yet he persisted, writing furiously. In 1843 alone, he published 9 works that examined, in fine-grained detail, the manifold possibilities of human existence. He became increasingly critical of the Danish state church, suggesting it was little more than a superficial institution that confused social conformity with genuine Christian faith. He likened the church to a theater that attempts to pass itself off as reality, whereas at least an actual theater admits that it's presenting artifice. He also told a parable about a clown who warns theatergoers of a real fire, only to be met with applause, as they assume he is merely performing, suggesting that society, too, might be too complacent or naive to perceive an impending disaster. In his major writings, Kierkegaard advocated what he termed inwardness or subjectivity. By this, he meant that the richest truths about life and faith lie in personal experience rather than objective or abstract contemplation. He disliked the purely objective approach to Christianity, which he saw as a religion fundamentally about the individual's relationship to God, a relationship that must be forged personally, not inherited or institutionalized. The more the church became a social or political body, the more it eroded that personal connection, resulting in what he thought of as hollow religiosity. Meanwhile, Karl Marx, a near contemporary of Kierkegaard's, proposed that history's great tides determine much of human life, with the individual functioning largely as a product of economic and social forces. In stark contrast, Kierkegaard believed that genuine reality happens at the level of the individual via personal decisions and subjective experiences. For him, the crowd was dangerous because it seduced people into relinquishing individual responsibility. This tension between historical social perspectives on the one hand and personal existential perspectives on the other remains relevant today, serving as a foundation for ongoing debates about structure versus agency, society versus the individual, and so forth. Kierkegaard's distaste for mass mentality expressed itself in his commentary on the modern phenomenon of consumerism. He worried that in a consumer-driven society, people would grow ever more comfortable, losing the sense that they are unique individuals with a personal calling. Instead, they would merge into a superficial herd, limiting spiritual depth and authentic selfhood. In his view, everyone who has left a genuine mark on the Christian faith had tried to spread a real, demanding message. His own mission was the opposite, to halt what he saw as the diluted, dishonest spread of social Christianity, a polite semblance of faith unaccompanied by the existential struggle and leap of faith he believed true Christianity required. He wrote in his diary about the mismatch between real Christianity and the institutional religion of his day. His diaries are full of scathing remarks about the crowd and about how ordinary social life inevitably co-opts religious truth, turning it into cultural form rather than living faith. Kierkegaard recognized the paradox in wanting to be an individual while also acknowledging that no one can live completely outside society. We are shaped by our environment, language, and culture. But for him, the challenge was to maintain personal authenticity even within social contexts that promote conformity. The tension he describes resonates with many aspects of modern life, where people struggle to resist mindlessly internalizing cultural expectations. One of Kierkegaard's literary hallmarks was his habit of attributing his works to fictional figures, sometimes complete with mock editors and compilers who would appear in the text. He believed this method underscored the fact that truth, in some contexts, is best arrived at indirectly, like parables or Socratic dialogues. Socrates, indeed, was one of his great heroes, a man who refused to systematize his insights, choosing to question relentlessly in search of personal truth, ultimately leading to his condemnation. Kierkegaard, likewise, rejected any system of philosophy, contending that the act of system-building kills the living dynamism of thought, a criticism he frequently aimed at G.W.F. Hegel and his followers. This anti-system stance becomes quite evident in works like Either Slash or a pivotal text that examines two distinct ways of living, the aesthetic and the ethical. Each path represents a form of existence, or as Kierkegaard would say, a stage along life's way. The aesthetic stage is driven by sensual pleasure, enjoyment of art, music, romance, and the thrill of novelty. This realm can stave off boredom, but it ultimately proves fleeting and shallow, as it focuses on immediate gratification and lacks deeper meaning. Eventually, the reflective individual realizes that an exclusive dedication to the aesthetic cannot satisfy the longing for a more enduring sense of purpose. Hence, Kierkegaard proposes a second stage, the ethical, grounded in moral codes, social responsibilities, and principles of duty. The ethical stage moves beyond the immediate pursuit of personal pleasure. Here, we consider the well-being of others and act according to broader, more universal norms. It is akin to what Freud later described as the superego, those internalized societal expectations. The ethical mode offers stability and can foster communal respect, but it still may neglect the individual's inner spiritual quest. Adopting the ethical standpoint uncritically might lead to an unexamined conformity, abiding by conventional rules without deeply personal conviction or self-discovery. Kierkegaard did not try to compel readers to choose one stage over the other. Rather, he wanted them to see how different styles of existence change one's relationship with life and meaning. He believed that philosophy, if it becomes overly abstract, forgets its primary mission of guiding individuals. Thus, his writings continually return to the question, how do we find meaning that applies to real human life? In Stages on Life's Way, which follows Either Slash, or he added a third stage, the religious. As a deeply convinced, if unorthodox, Christian, he viewed the religious stage as the highest level of personal commitment, in which one rests entirely on faith. However, Kierkegaard's conception of faith was not simply intellectual assent, but a passionate existential leap, an embrace of the absurd that lacks logical proof, yet offers spiritual solace. He famously wrote of the leap of faith, describing it as irrational from a strictly logical standpoint, but the most genuine way to live once a person realizes that purely rational or systematic solutions will never resolve the profound anxieties of existence. In Fear and Trembling, he explored the biblical story of Abraham, who, in obedience to God, prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, only for God to intervene at the last moment. By presenting several hypothetical retellings of that event, Kierkegaard investigated how ethical norms can clash with religious devotion, and how Abraham's ordeal represents what he called a teleological suspension of the ethical. That is, if one believes wholeheartedly in God's higher purpose, one might set aside human moral laws, trusting an ultimate divine plan. Though ethically incomprehensible, It becomes, in Kierkegaard's view, the purest expression of faith. Fear and trembling also distinguishes between the night of infinite resignation and the night of faith. The former surrenders the finite joys of life, reconciling themselves to eternal love or spiritual ideals, but not expecting them to actualize in this world. By contrast, the night of faith goes a step further by believing that with God, all things are possible, even those that appear impossible from human standpoint. This second figure paradoxically retains his love for the world while trusting that God's grace can bring about unlikely outcomes, a stance that exemplifies faith's defiance of normal logic. Much of Kierkegaard's writing underscores emotions such as anxiety, despair, and dread, or angst, which he saw as direct consequences of our radical freedom and the enormity of existence. He argued that we can become paralyzed by the multitude of possible paths we might take, never fully committing to one, thus effectively forfeiting our freedom. Alternatively, we might thoughtlessly follow the crowd, adopting cultural norms without true self-reflection. Either way, we evade full, authentic existence. For Kierkegaard, a life lived on autopilot, dictated by social expectations, could never yield genuine individuality or deeper meaning. We only become true individuals by confronting the anxiety of choice, making a leap and acting on it. He used vivid illustrations to make these points. For example, consider the archetype of someone who marries their childhood sweetheart because that's what people do, invests in a stable career, and lives in the suburbs. This is not inherently bad. But if these decisions stem solely from social convention rather than personal conviction, the person has effectively stifled their capacity to choose freely. A crisis often emerges when such an individual realizes they are living inauthentically, having never personally willed their life. That crisis, though painful, can also be transformative, prompting a leap of faith in some new direction. Kierkegaard's brand of faith, however, is not guaranteed to bring clarity or relief in the usual sense. Rather, it acknowledges the inherent absurdity of existence. God's existence is neither provable nor disprovable by reason. One must simply decide to believe. Yet for Kierkegaard, this type of faith was the only sure path to forging a genuine link with the divine, avoiding a purely cultural or herd Christianity that he so despised. In his journaling, he frequently hammered away at what he considered the illusions of Christendom, an environment where almost everyone was labeled a Christian, yet few truly wrestled with the demands of Christian faith. By the time he reached his early 40s, his inherited wealth had dwindled, and his health, never robust, declined precipitously. He collapsed in the street and ended up in a hospital. On his deathbed, he continued to reject the Danish church's official rituals, refusing the Last Communion and declining to see his own brother, Peter, who was a bishop. He died at 42, leaving behind a scathing condemnation of modern Christendom, which he felt was no more than the extension of social and political structures, a type of religion that had lost its existential heart. Kierkegaard's funeral drew a surprisingly large crowd, at which a protest broke out against allowing the very institution he attacked, Denmark's established church, to officiate his burial. This disturbance ironically echoed the rebellious spirit that had characterized his entire life. He had always existed on the margins, unwilling to comply with social norms at the expense of personal sincerity. He was considered odd by many, a strange, solitary figure, well off financially for most of his adult life, but isolated from mainstream circles, deeply reflective, caustically witty, and unafraid to wage public controversies through his pen. Though largely neglected by readers in his own era, Kierkegaard's ideas found a more receptive audience well after his death. The advent of existentialist thought in the 20th century, championed by figures such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger, revealed how profoundly Kierkegaard had prefigured many of their central concerns: alienation, authenticity, the meaning of freedom, and the interplay of faith and despair. Kierkegaard's emphasis on subjective truth, on the idea that each of us must become an individual by actively choosing how to live, rather than passively adopting external systems, has become a cornerstone in the study of existential philosophy, theology, and psychology. Hence, in reflecting on Kierkegaard's legacy, we see a man who championed the notion that philosophy should originate in life itself, with its confusions, leaps of faith, and anxieties. His writings remind us that no grand system or social institution can resolve our personal crises or bestow upon us genuine freedom. We remain singular beings, alone before God and alone with our choices. All the illusions society provides, rituals, cultural norms, or moral systems, will not suffice as a genuine existential compass unless we ourselves adopt them passionately, in full consciousness of what we are doing. Kierkegaard's insight that the simplest truths, like being an individual, are often the hardest for us to fully embrace continues to resonate. For him, the risk of existing is immense. We never can be absolutely certain whether our chosen path is correct. Anxiety, despair, and dread lurk whenever we recognize that no objective confirmation is forthcoming. But instead of allowing these emotions to shatter us, Kierkegaard invited us to muster our courage and commit to a path anyway, trusting that in so doing, we become truly ourselves. It is precisely this invitation that has made Kierkegaard a towering figure in modern thought. Though he lived and died as an oddity in 19th century Denmark, his willingness to question the complacency of the crowd, his unwavering focus on the inward, subjective dimension of life, and his insistence on the necessity of personal responsibility and decision all cemented his reputation as one of the forebears of existential philosophy. Ultimately, he taught that in order to find meaning, we must not seek it exclusively in abstract reasoning or external structures, but in our own lived commitment, a leap into uncertainty, guided by a faith that is, paradoxically, both entirely personal and entirely beyond rational comprehension. In conclusion, Søren Kierkegaard stands as a vital voice reminding us that even in a world offering countless social scripts and theoretical frameworks, meaning arises first and foremost from within. Whether we choose to call that act of commitment religious, existential, or simply human, the spirit of Kierkegaard's message rings clear. To exist is to choose, to risk, to embrace the interplay of despair and faith, and ultimately to discover in that leap the possibility of authentic selfhood.